I have a question on flints. There's been a lot written about flints and whether leather binder for the flints or lead binder for the flints is better. And if you use leather, should you glue it in or not? So any thoughts on those?
Who wants to talk about the flint? What you hold it with, whether it's leather or lead?
We recommend leather for ours because to me, a lot of times lead will transfer too much of that shock back into the cock, and I've seen cocks break because of that. I know on some military guns, it's pretty standard practice to wrap the flint in lead, but usually those cocks are much more massive than these quarter locks, essentially, that we're using.
What about gluing the flint to the leather?
Pretty handy. I do that for a little test flint that we use on some of our locks because I'm taking it in and out. I'm only striking the prison once or twice and trying to stumble around with the leather and the flint and everything. If I glue it on there, it seems to work great.
In European sporting arms, a lot of those cased examples and so forth have red leather, so the lead is definitely a military thing, and I've seen any number of European sporting arms that still have the leather. Some of them have agate flints, and they'll have that. They're very fine. So I prefer leather. It's just a softer medium, and a lot of our flints are not necessarily so accommodating. Sometimes you can break the flint with that lead because it's got a high spot, and I think the leather gives you a better cushion when you tighten it down.
You ever have the same problem with like vegetable tan leathers that just get real hard?
Vegetable tan leathers that get real hard, yes, they will.
Oh, I can see.
I like brain tan. It's soft and gives you doesn't do well in the rain.
Can I ask you a question about chisels as opposed to rasps in an 18th century, early 19th century gun shop? Did they use both interchangeably? Was one thought to be a higher art form when contouring a stockwood over the other?
Okay, you're asking, are they using more cutting tools to shape stocks and less rasps and files? Okay.
Right.
That's a tough one because a lot of that material is worn off.
Yeah.
The finishing, but I think a lot of the ideas of finishing totally with shaves were very much revived in the arts and craft period in the late 19th century when they started making all those fantastic planes and so forth. And it was a no-no to put a rasp on a piece of wood.
Yeah.
In the 18th century, you find a mixed combination, whatever would do it most efficiently.
Yeah.
And I find that in furniture as well.
Same thing.
A shaped cabriolet leg, which would be, very parallel to a shaping of a burl gun stock,
yeah,
or root wood or whatever. They're using rasps on that a lot, as well as shave tools. Now I have an early rifle in the rack here that's cherry stock, and when you hold it, you hold the butt up and look at it in glancing light.
Yeah.
The guy used shave tools to do everything, and it was not scraped, sanded, or anything else. Now he was good, but when that gun came out as a cherry stock with new finish, you would have seen those facets all over. It would have been, to our modern, very raw.
Yeah.
But I don't think they saw that carving was cut clean with the chisels, and good carving was not sanding, was not scraping, it was carving.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of the early rifles that we see you would be upset with today because the finish mode today is so affected by the overworking of Industrial Revolution products. Too much sanding and so forth.
That was an accepted fact.
Yeah, I think, and I think if you're
and
talking
that might
about,
have been part of their style.
he's saying that's part of the style is the accepted fact that it has those cut. Yeah. And when you're talking about relief carving, if you've got good clean cuts with the right tools, then it reads well, and the corners, it's making shadow. Is what it's really about. You're making shadows and highlights, And so the well carved stuff that doesn't resort to all these other finishes. So many guns people make today, they get the sandpaper out, and it looks more like slug contours than it does sharp, clean carving. I mean, that's the extreme, but you know, it's sandpaper was a little available in the 18th century, but gun makers that you have many records on aren't using much of it.
So they're just using good, crisp chisels and
for a higher finish scraper. But if you look at this early rifle, if I made a rifle like, if I had the skill to make it like that today, I would have trouble selling it, because the expectation of the Industrial Revolution mind is that it's highly finished.
Brumfield,
Cabinet scrapers were used quite abundantly then. Cabinet scrapers were used a lot.
Yes. Cabinet. He's saying his cabinet scrapers were used a lot. I think, you know, obviously on long rifles, you get moldings that are fluted, and that's usually a scraper rather than a block plane because of the nature of the work. But scraping was a way to finish backgrounds with clean cuts.
Come on, guy.
let that guy get out of the way here.
I tell him to do that every time you speak, Jim.
I was talking with Gary Brumfield back last winter about a particular custom gun that I'd seen, and the carving wasn't as crisp as could be. And Gary said in the gun shop there at Williamsburg, they used to refer to that as soap carving. I said, "What do you mean soap carving?" And he said, "Well, you take a bar of soap and you carve this really detailed set of carving in that bar of soap. You know, all the edges are nice and crisp, and then you go take a bath with it."
And the sandpaper does that to it.
Sandpaper does that. Yep.
There ain't much skill in sandpaper is what you're trying to tell me.
Well, it has its problems.
Yep.
I think sandpaper goes.
You like lollipops.
Sandpaper goes a lot more in long rifles when they start dropping the carving and they're going into violin finishes in the, you know, particularly early 19th century, when they were doing very, you know, you're getting these very silky quality finishes for then violin layers of colored varnishes that are built up, and they are very slick. And carving was going out of fashion, and many of those guns are in size carved because that doesn't interfere with that process. And I think they're very misunderstood today because often that's destroyed, that original finishing process. But they were finishing them like neoclassic furniture is finished.
When knapping a flint, there's a lot of energy transferred down to the sear nose. And then, of course, modern steels, being alloys, they can be brittle. If we don't do our drawing or tempering right, we're going to have brittle. In the olden days, was there a preferred technique on knapping a flint and not destroy the internals of the lock?
Did everybody hear that question about knapping the flint and damage to the sear? Or the dog, as they call it. Dog, yeah. I don't know when sears came in, but it doesn't seem to. It came in with Roebuck, okay. Mark there you go, Mark. That's where Mark Baker gets his 18th century outfit. You set yourself up on that. But so I think that there were what I call an awl. A lot of long rifles have wire loops under the cheek piece and a metal holder under there. And I've only seen 2 of those surviving. And they're always called touch hole picks, but they're actually an awl which has a head that's thick enough to be a napper. And a touch hole pick really needs to be almost a wire. Many early powder horns had the stopper have the touch hole pricker on it. And that awl was used for disassembling the gun, knapping flints, and repairing moccasins and things like that in the field. I think they did a lot of that. You know, I always like to have a piece of brass when I napped a flint, and you know, when you got a loaded gun, or if you got a misfire, I do those kind of things. Point them at an unfriendly friend. I always keep pointing in a safe direction. One time I had I was keeping in a safe direction, shooting from my bench in the mountains, and it finally went off, and it hit the telephone pole, and ricocheted 150 yards and took the window out of my neighbor. So, sometimes it's just luck, but I don't know if you're napping a real thick flint. What you're talking about is very true, and you know some people are firing set triggers when it's at half cock. That's a disaster. I don't know of any record of how they were napping flints. If anybody's got an 18th century record of that, I just don't recall seeing anything that would document that, except these tools, which, you know, we presume that's when it's not loaded that you're packing that flint in the cock. Yes.
It's not to be crude or anything, but the process of loading a rifle and maintaining it in 18th century documents is a lot like the process of going to the bathroom. Everybody did it, but no one talked about it. And so we know they went to the bathroom. We know they had bowel movements, but no one explained exactly how they did it. We know they were shooting the rifles and maintaining them, but that process explanation is largely absent from any primary documents. That those details are just ignored.
The daily common things don't get written down, so we
I read an account in Davy Crockett's autobiography where they were going to attack an Indian encampment or something or other, and he said they picked their flints afresh. Was the way he described it.
that sounds like the wording sounds good. I'd really like to know about.
Yeah, it's in his autobiography.
I'd like to know where the original is, if that's been. Did he have a footnote?
Well, it was his autobiography, so whether he wrote it or not.
Oh, okay, his autobiography.
So what do you mean by pick?
Well, yeah, I would
Autobiography,
make
he got
that,
killed at the mail.
just kind of caught something on the edge or something, and just took little flakes off or something.
We're trying to figure out how he did an autobiography and he got killed at the Alamo.
He wrote fast.
It was done when he was a big politician.
Okay. 1832. Mark knows about that. It's 1832. You familiar with that reference?
Yeah, but he's also tells what does he mean by picking? That's probably a closer term of southern Tennessee.
Yeah.
The trick is what does he mean by that word?
Yeah.
I don't know.
But it sounds like that's shocking.
Yeah.
Could he mean that he's just picking out the best flints he had? Picking them out?
No, they
Picking
said
the flint
they said they picked it afresh.
Fresh.
So I assumed they had the same
Yeah,
flint.
sounds like a good reference.
Making sure that the edge was good and sharp because they were about to attack the Indians and they wanted their rifles.
And anybody that's hunted with these, and if you're hunting a wounded animal, which I did once, you check that really often. You got that one shot, so that sounds like a good reference. I wasn't aware of it.
What does the pick mean now?
Yeah. Well,
I don't know if it was some sort of like pressure plating or something like that.
I imagine they pulled out their knife and
well, if he's got one of those balls, he might have called that just,
He might have like stuck it under the edge and pulled it up towards him just to break it.
Like he's doing on an ironhead.
I don't know.
But it's easier to just whack it.
I have a question for any of you. Not that we try to duplicate this or anything. So many American riflemen show up from the frontiers of Maryland, Virginia at the beginning of the war. They go to doing shooting contests, putting the boards between their knees, shooting at 100 yards, 175 yards, some say 200 yards, and they're shooting these planks. How is it possible to get accuracy in a modern gun when we don't shoot off? Is it possible to hit a 4x8 piece of wood at 200 yards in our day and age without using the equipment of that frontier, without using oversized balls, without using? Is it possible? They were doing it, as the stories go. The stories are half as true. They're hitting planks out between their neighbors' knees at 100 yards. Is that possible? The guy holding the board must have been drunk.
There's the one account where they were two brothers, but
they had more kids at the
I don't think there's many people that can shoot a standard long rifle that well today. When I was in my 20s, I made some shots that were really surprising to me, at out to 125 yards, hitting starlings in a tree, and with Kentucky windage. So you could, I shot in about a year and a half a long rifle that would no longer group. I shot that much through it, that it started grouping here and there, and the ball was slipping, and freshed it out, and it went right back again. But when I looked inside that barrel, it looked like it was chrome plated, and it was an iron barrel that I had freshed out to begin with. But I can believe that those guys, there's too many references to them making remarkable shots, and they knew it. And I shot it with that rifle I made in the movie at 300 yards across a big cornfield that all that was left was a stubble, a stalk in the fall, and at a 3-foot-high box. And I was a younger man with different eyes. Okay, at about a 3-foot-high box, this wide cardboard box, I was hitting it about 1 in 5 shots, and I was hitting around. Now, the tree line had mature oaks at about 500 yards, and I was up in the crotches of those where I was aiming. And you learn how far it'll drop. But my first couple shots were way short, and I had to go higher. But a guy who did that as practice, I think, if you were out there, you wouldn't have been very comfortable if I was shooting at you, and I'd have hit you one time with one that bounced off the ground, you know. But they have, you know, I think they did a lot of remarkable shooting. But remember, these guys lived it, and shooting matches were often set up by stores in the community because they had the material for the prizes. Mark and I were talking about this earlier today, and we see accounts in the Shenandoah Valley where the guy goes to the store and he loses money at the shooting match on wagers with the owner. He buys lots of rum, and then he loses at cards. So the store owners got them in there, sold them rum, have the shooting match. It's really quite interesting. And one store in what's now West Virginia in the 1770s, they sold chances to shooting the new year several times. And more often than not, guys buy 7 chances, or they buy 3 or 4, which is a part of 7. I think that 7 numbers is
God's magic number in the Bible.
Yeah,
it's a perfect number.
Yeah, but I think they were doing some awfully accurate shooting because you live it.
So you would know your trajectory at 300 yards because you've been practicing it.
Yeah.
I think few of us today could ride a horse as well as people in the 18th century because they did it every day.
Especially with some of the gear they had.
Yeah.